this is just terrifying for cancer patients and for the healthcare industry as a whole. The U.S. is facing a national shortage of more than a dozen cancer medications and is now considering allowing for the temporary importation of chemotherapy drugs from overseas manufacturers that are not currently approved to distribute in the United States. Now, doctors at hospitals around the country say the situation is particularly acute for two drugs, that's cisplatin and carboplatin, because they're so fundamental and widely used in cancer treatment. In fact, up to 20% of cancer patients rely on these specific drugs, and some medical professionals are calling this shortage a national security issue. Now, the most recent shortage came after a plant in India producing the drugs shut down due to quality concerns, but the low cost of generic frontline cancer drugs has actually played a major role in recurrent chemotherapy drug shortages, since pharmaceutical companies apparently are not incentivized to sell and produce them because they don't bring in large profits. Well, joining us now to discuss is MD Julie Gralow, Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President at ASCO. Now, this is not the first time that the U.S. has experienced a cancer drug shortage. What has triggered this? Break this down for us.
You're right. We've had these shortages going on for at least 10 years now, but this is the most acute shortage I've seen in my 30-year career as an oncologist. What happened, as you've indicated, is there was a quality issue that shut down one plant in India that makes the raw materials that then go on to be turned into these cancer drugs. What was not known was just how widely the different manufacturers were using the same materials from this one plant. So first, cisplatin, a very key drug in treating a lot of cancers, started being made in less quantities because of this shutdown. They couldn't get the raw materials. And then a common substitute, carboplatin, which there was no issue with that really in terms of the amount that was being made until it was stressed and we started substituting carbo. A disaster. We think 100,000 to 500,000 Americans are potentially impacted by this.
What does this mean for those patients who are impacted by this? How is this going to change their quality of life?
Well, we're working very hard on making recommendations for how to squeeze out the last bit of these drugs that many sites still have, how to reduce the dose, give it less frequently, use the vials more efficiently. But in many cases, we're also working on making recommendations for alternate regimens that might be tested but not as commonly used. Mm-hmm. Now, so on the provider side, we're struggling with what can we do for the best care for our patient? What alternates are available? On the patient side, think about you've been diagnosed with cancer. You've been told, here's your regimen. You've started treatment with the regimen that your doctors, your team told you was the best, and now a drug isn't available. Even if there's an acceptable alternate that we can recommend, think of the fear and anxiety on top of that already caused by the cancer diagnosis that occurs.
Right. I mean, you just can't help but ask, why isn't there a stockpile of drugs like this in the United States? Why is the U.S. not prepared for this issue, especially if this is not the first time?
It's hard to know what to stockpile, although I'll tell you that strategic reserves are part of the discussion of how do we prevent this in the future. It's not just cancer drugs that we've had shortages of in the U.S. We've had shortages of asthma drugs, diabetes drugs. It could happen to infectious disease drugs next. So figuring out which are the essential drugs and having some sort of reserve, whether it be at the government level, at the manufacturer level, or where, is part of the discussion we're having. Right. Choosing which drugs is part of the difficult part of it.
You know, pharmaceuticals are also being slammed for basically not selling and producing generic versions of these drugs because they don't bring in enough of a profit. You know, my question is, can government get involved to control this? Why isn't government getting involved to control this? Because this is a human right and ultimately a national security risk.
I testified just yesterday in our House Energy and Commerce Committee on that exact issue. How can and should government get involved? And it was absolutely agreed that from a bipartisan, standpoint, everybody wants to fix this. But what can we do? We have maybe some legislative fixes. We might have some regulatory fixes, but really this was a market failure, as you've indicated. Mm-hmm. Once drugs go generic, then the originator companies frequently stop making them. We have a bunch of generic and biosimilar now companies coming in, and it's a race to the bottom in terms of price. Who can sell it for the cheapest? And so the high quality plants that that might be rated higher in terms of resiliency, et cetera, they can't make it for that price.
Right.
So we're going to have to come up with some incentives from a market standpoint. We're going to have to reward high quality manufacturers, hopefully get more of this back in the United States again. We're working on how to incentivize it, pay a bit more. It's so ironic that these drugs are so cheap, and yet we contrast that with the newest drugs that are on patent that can cost $10,000, $20,000 a dose, and these drugs cost less than $100 a dose.